Well, hello, everybody. I'm very, very excited today to have a special guest on the program. You probably know that there's a lot going on in Israel right now, and I can only go so far as to figure out what's going on and to explain it to my audience. So I thought I would have my friend David Tal do a little interview with us, and he's been going all over the place in the U.S. right now on the West Coast doing interviews after interviews, and he's been kind enough to take the time today to do it with us. So, welcome to the show, David. It's good to have you.
Well, thank you. It's good to be here, though I think you would appreciate the fact that it's kind of weird for me to be here now with everything that's going on back home.
Well, yeah,
Uh,
I'm
it's
sure
it's
you would
it's
rather be home.
complicated.
You would rather be home. I'm sure
Yes.
you. Yeah, I understand that. Well, David, I know about your background, but some people might not. So tell us a little bit about your background. Why am I calling you to talk to us about Israel? What do you know about Israel? I mean, where are you
Oh,
from?
well, let's start off with the beginning. I know the accent is American. I know I sound like an American, but basically, besides the accent, and because uh, I think I may be one of the five people who know all the rules of American football that live in Israel. I am an Israeli. I'm not an
Okay.
American. So I was born in the U.S., but I grew up, was educated, served in the military, married, and work in Israel for the rest of my life.
All right.
So the basic aspect is that I come with a little bit of American, how do you say, accent, but I am here to take the story of Israel off the History Channel and off the documentary channel and off the news channel and put it on the ground because people tend to forget that it's not something that's happening over there. It's something that's happening to us over here.
That is correct. So now, do you have a background in Israel? I mean, did you work? Did you
Well,
serve?
here's in a couple of words my basic background. Born in the States to two Americans who decided to make their life in Israel. We emigrated. Oh, actually, we came over the first time in 1966. Both of my parents were young Christians and decided to be a part of the story of Israel. We lived in Jerusalem. My dad was a student, studied archaeology and Semitic languages in the Hebrew U. We were here during the Six-Day War. During the Six-Day War, my parents said, this is where we want to raise our family.
Ah,
So we came back to the States for a couple of years for administration problems. In 1971, we emigrated to Israel. Um, Hebrew Christians, Messianic Jews, all of the above names are what would define us as the beginning of the Messianic movement in Israel. I grew up as a young Christian in a Jewish environment. That's a whole story. If you want to go into there, that would be very interesting to kind of touch that. The Messianic movement was just growing up. My an elder and one of the first. We were all part of this. I grew up at the age of 18, like everybody else. I went into the military. So they kicked me out of pilot's training because I was not good enough. And yes, we do have the best pilots in the world. They put me on a tank, and I've been on tanks ever since. Uh, Rose to the ranks, sergeant, lieutenant. I am a major in the IDF. Until a couple of years ago, I commanded a tank company in reserve. They took my company away from me because I'm not as young and handsome as I used to be. I'm still learning to live with that one. And I did a couple of years in the security apparatus, both in Cyprus and in Paris. And so that's a little bit of my background. I live in Israel. I live in a place called Modi'in, where the Maccabees started the revolt. And I am a tour guide today and totally entrenched in what's going on and totally connected both to the Israeli side and the evangelical Christian side. So that's how all of this ties together.
okay. How long have you been in the States this time? You've been here for a while.
About a week right now.
Oh, okay, okay. And then you're looking to return as soon as you can.
Well, I'm trying to decide. I'm a tour guide by trade, and there's no tourists in Israel right now.
Right.
Uh, and I will add, maybe just to put this in context, all my life I've defended this country from the back of a tank. I've seen combat everywhere from the Golan Heights to Lebanon to Gaza and the West Bank. So I've been in it. But since I don't have a tank anymore, it is my duty to defend Israel in the war that is being fought against Israel, and I'm sure we're going to be talking about this, that is a different kind of war. It's not the physical war. It's not only the rockets and the bombs and the shells. It is a war for the legitimacy, for the heart, and for the moral position of Israel in the world. And I think that's important.
That is very important. So you mentioned the conflict that's going on right now. I don't know what to call it yet, if we should call it a full-blown war, a conflict, and third intifada. We'll get to that in a minute. But summarize for us what's going on and where we are as of right now. I think as of last night, we heard in the States, from whatever news outlet that we can trust, that Israel was on the edge of Gaza and they were just about ready to walk in. So how did this? What's going on and how did it get started? To give a background of what's going on.
Well, one of the hardest problems for people like me and you to explain this is the complexity of this, and maybe we'll go into it. But there's at least 4 levels of conflict that have come together at this point of intersection that we're dealing with right now. But I'm going to do something a little bit different. I'm going to say this.
Okay.
I called my mom this morning. She lives in Modin. She was sitting in the bomb shelter with the iron curtains. We have bomb shelters, reinforced concrete rooms in every house in Israel. And she was sitting in there behind an iron shutter, okay, after the sirens had gone off, hearing missiles exploding over her head. So if you want to put it in a nutshell, rockets are being fired into civilian neighborhoods all over Israel right now. The reason is why, and I think that's what we're going to be discussing, but let's not forget for a moment what is actually happening. Civilians are being targeted by a terrorist organization who wants to change the political situation. And one of the things that me and you would agree with is, why isn't the world up in arms and screaming about this?
Yeah, I mean, this is beyond me. I mean, I heard this morning a short video from the consul general who was on the show with James Cadiz with you, and he mentioned that this is a double war crime because Hamas is, and I didn't think about it, but it's very true. Hamas is shooting from civilian areas, even sometimes probably hoping that Israel would retaliate so they can really make the news in a way that would benefit them. And then they're shooting at civilians in Israel. They don't care where their rockets land, as opposed to, I know that I've heard, and you can confirm that Israel always warns civilian areas where they're going to do something before they do it. Is that correct?
I'm going to be truthful, and I'm going to say, in many cases, yes. In some cases, no. And I'll give you 2 examples. Israel targeted a underground bunker 2 days ago with the high command of the Hamas sitting inside Gaza. I don't think they warned anybody on that case because it was underground and it was away from civilian population.
Right. Makes sense.
On the other hand, we wanted to take down one of the main offices and coordination centers that the Hamas was using in a 10-story building inside Gaza. It is a legitimate target. I mean, according to any rules of engagement, the Geneva Convention and everything else. But in this case, because there was a large amount of civilian population in the area, and James showed part of the film yesterday that I wish I could spread a little bit more. We literally called the superintendent of the building and told him, we're going to bring the building down, get everybody out of the building. And the superintendent, you can hear him saying in Hebrew, okay, when is it going to happen? And they told him, when you hear the small explosions on the roof, that's when the building is going to come down. So make sure everybody's out by then. Which means Israel calls the superintendent, warns him, puts a small non-lethal explosion on the roof to make sure everybody gets the idea, and only then will take out the target in order to minimize the civilian population. And when people make a moral equivalency between rockets that are fired indiscriminately into civilian population and Israel trying to take out military targets with a tweezer kind of attack in order to make sure nobody is hurt, when people make the moral equivalency between those two, you get the idea that there's something more than going on than just regular opinion.
Absolutely. Now, why is this, on the news, in the US news, all you see, they crop the news. And I'm not saying just on the video, in general, they crop the news to whatever segment will feed the agenda. So, nobody saw the conversation that was being had between Israel, the gentleman, and the superintendent. I saw it yesterday on your video. But we don't hear about that. All we hear is the other side. Israel is, and then very often we don't even hear the word retaliating, defending herself. All we hear is Israel is getting into Gaza and basically killing innocent Palestinians. And it's been going on for a long time. But why is it different this time? Do you think it's different? What's going on? Is it going to continue escalating?
No, I don't think it's different. I think in the last Gaza row, for a lot of different reasons, I was outside the country, actually in Vietnam, and the only
You
news
talk
source,
about 2014?
2014,
Yeah, okay.
and the only news source was the CNN and the BBC. And I'm sitting there and watching what's going on, and I'm saying, in order for somebody to zoom in like that, they have to have an agenda. And the agenda is not to give you the news as is. I'll give you an example. Um, Israel was inside Gaza. There was fighting going on. They had a large amount of showing Israeli tanks and Israeli forces inside Gaza, but they never showed the Hamas fighters firing at the tanks. I mean, you see the tanks in Gaza, you don't see the Hamas fighters. Now, I'm saying to myself, you have all of the world's military reporters in Gaza. That's where the news is. The best reporters, people that have Pulitzer Prizes and are the main reporters at CNN, they're in and they cannot get one shot of a Hamas fighter firing at the Israeli tanks. On the other hand, they have as much footage as they want of the Israeli tanks firing back. So you say to yourself, are they incapable? Or is there a policy that says we only want to show this side and we don't want to show the other side?
Let me play devil's advocate for a second. Is it possible that the Palestinian Authority or the Hamas leadership is telling them, do not film us?
No, it's not only possible, it's probably what was done, because there were a few cases where some did seep through the cracks. And we know that there was a Dutch reporter who actually reported that the bunker of the Hamas was underneath the main hospital in Gaza. Okay, so if you put a bunker, you put your headquarters underneath the hospital, he actually reported it and he was kicked out of Gaza the next day. So we know that in order for them, but I think it's more than that, because, okay, he managed to get out. So let's say the reporters, or why don't we see it afterward? There is an agenda to show the Palestinians as the victims.
Of course.
And there's a reason for that. And I'm going to say I specialize in my side of the border. Maybe we can talk about what's going on in the United States and why are the Palestinians being posed or put into the victim role in a society that has now turned victimhood into an honorable trait. And this is lining up with a lot of different things that are happening in your culture. And that's why it makes more sense. I mean, I saw the Daily Show yesterday. I don't know if I don't know, his name is Trev or something, and I was listening to what he said. And one of the things, the interesting things that he said is this. He said, I don't know who is right. I don't know who is wrong. I don't have more information. I don't see what's going on. All I see is that on this side, 3 people died, and on this side, 20 people died. And I see is that Israel is stronger and the Palestinians are weaker. And if you're stronger, you should know how to be able to take the blows without retaliating. If you're strong, somebody comes at you with a knife, you shouldn't shoot him. And I'm saying to myself, where does that moral equivalency come in? I mean, what do you mean? If somebody's going to attack your daughter with a knife, and the only way you can stop him is shooting him, you will shoot him. But you didn't instigate this, and you are not morally wrong in doing this.
That is true. But see, I think what's happening, David, is, and correct me if I'm wrong, we've had this Palestinian displaced people, stolen land narrative that started about 50 some years ago by Yasser Arafat. And at the beginning, not everybody was buying it. They were confronting it with the truth. They were comparing, but eventually, you know what? It was attributed to I think to either Goebbels or Hitler. When when you tell a lie long enough, it ends up being believed as the truth. And I think that's what's been happening for the last 50 years. That lie has been spread, and then the shifting of the victims into the perpetrators and the perpetrators into the victim is has completely changed the perception of most of the world. And even though there's really no truth at the foundation of that.
Um, if you want, here's an excellent recommendation. If your viewers want to do something very interesting to see the difference in that, there was a movie that came out in the 1960s called Exodus. I don't know if you remember that. Paul Newman played
Paul Newman, yes.
played in Exodus.
I'm not that old, but I'm that old.
Okay, there you go. Though we always find it interesting to see Paul Newman as an Israeli. I mean, he's too pretty to be an Israeli. But okay, that's a whole different story. But you go back to Paul Newman in Exodus, or if you want to do something really, really interesting, get your hands on a movie called Cast a Giant Shadow, starring Kirk Douglas, Frank Sinatra. I mean, all of the Hollywood stars from back then that depicted the Battle of 1948, where the Jews were the victims and the minority and the underdogs, standing up to the Arab world, and Hollywood and the whole Western culture, the whole Western civilization was rooting and clapping for the Jews. When we're being stomped on, we sometimes, and again, this is a Jewish perspective, we sometimes get a little bit of sympathy, sometimes not, by the way. From Europe, no, from the United States, because of their Christian background, we will get more sympathy. But that completely gets erased the minute we stand up and become strong. The minute the Jew stands up and defends himself, then the world is not willing to accept the strong Jew, is not willing to accept a strong Israel, and also is not willing to accept the fact that we take control of our own destiny. It's a different kind of anti-Semitism, which is very interesting. I mean, how come the Germans can defend themselves? How come the Iraqis can defend themselves? How come the Iranians can defend themselves? And we see that in a positive manner. But when the Jew defends himself, we see it as a problematic. That is a whole story in itself. And I think, in a nutshell, that's what we're touching.
So that would probably fall into the category that I call soft anti-Semitism. It is not the let's kill the Jews. They're vermin. They're a subculture, subhuman, like Hitler did. It would be more like the soft anti-Semitism where we're not helping. They're not helping, and but we're not looking to get them all killed. But soft anti-Semitism is often as dangerous and can lead to harder kinds of anti-Semitism. So we have to be aware of that. I think, David, you probably know that, and my audience has heard me before say that you cannot understand the hatred of Israel and the hatred of the Jews and anti-Semitism unless you understand that there is a spiritual component to it. It is not just from a human perspective, people always think that, human beings can get better and can do better things and they can learn, but there is a spiritual battle going on because Satan wants to destroy the Jews. That's at the foundation of all this, and he's using different people. He's using Palestinians, he's using people within the church, he's using people in the European Union, he's using people in Hollywood.
Use Nazi Germany, and in our situation. And we're about this far from the Security Council putting out a resolution that condemns Israel for defending itself. We're that close. And the United Nations and the United Nations full body will probably condemn Israel in any case for what's happening. And you don't need to be a genius to realize that Israel did not want this, did not instigate, and is really, really holding back right now. But we will be completely condemned by this. And when you think about, nobody condemns what the Chinese are doing to the Muslim minorities in China. Nobody talks about what the Iranians are doing to their minorities. Nobody talks about what's happening to different minorities all over the world. Who's going to be singled out for condemnation? It's going to be Israel.
Israel, absolutely. Now, do you think It's probably too early to tell, but could this turn into a third intifada? Because I also see, I've heard from reliable sources, and maybe you can help me with that, that there was some fear within Israel of some sort of a civil war because Arab Israelis are going after Jewish.
Okay. So just to put you on the, I don't know
I'm
how
thinking
much
about
you're.
the city of Lod as an example.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And again, okay. Just in a nutshell, what's going on right now? Okay. And maybe just to take this round of attacks and see if I can kind of condense it into a little bit. There was a legal issue about real estate in a village on the eastern side of Jerusalem, where Palestinians were being told that the houses that they lived in were owned by Jews before 1948, and legally they would have to pay rent to stay in those houses or they would have to leave. So that's a legal issue, a real estate issue, a court case, but the Palestinians decided to use that as an excuse to start demonstrations on the Temple Mount. So Israel says, wait a minute, we can't allow demonstrations on the Temple Mount. Then they decided to use the demonstrations on the Temple Mount as an excuse. Listen to this, okay? A demonstration as an excuse to fire rockets at civilian population, okay? In American terms, let's say that an organization that I'm not going to name has demonstrations in Oregon, and the National Guard in Oregon brings in tanks and starts firing indiscriminately into neighborhoods in Oregon, telling them make sure that these demonstrations stop. I mean, no, I mean, they're using terror tactics, okay, and that very quickly you realize that they're still waiting for an excuse that the terror tactics, okay, are being excused by the demonstration and not the other. Meaning the rockets were aimed, they were there, they were primed, they were waiting. The only thing they needed is somebody to say, okay,
Spark.
here's the excuse we need, and then they let the spark. And
Now,
you realize that.
so this whole thing that's happening right now is because of an eviction of squatters that was used to escalate to the point of taking them to the Temple Mount and where everything was ready to go. And so, but originally it was just a legal issue of squatters in a habitation somewhere.
Totally. But here's the thing. Just like, remember World War I started with the assassination of some semi-duke.
François Ferdinand, the Archduke, yeah.
Yeah, but after you look at it from today's point of view, you realize that the assassination was not the reason for the war. Everything was ready and primed. So the real estate issue is not the issue. Even the Temple Mount is not the issue. I will tell you what I think is more than anything on the short-term basis, and the issue is that inside the Palestinian peoples, there's an argument between the fundamentalist jihadi, let's kill everybody, Islam is the only religion, and faction, which are the Muslim Brotherhood, which are Al-Qaeda, which are ISIS, this kind of Muslim faction. And you've got a more moderate faction on the other side that says, okay, we read the Quran, but we don't have to kill everybody. Let's reach an agreement. And two very interesting things happen on the political level a lot of people are not talking about. The first one is that the Palestinians were supposed to have an election. The world is saying to the Palestinian people, you're supposed to be democratic, which means you're supposed to elect your leaders. The last election they had was 11 years ago, I think, and it was supposed to last for 3 years, and they have not had an election since. So the world is pushing them into a democratic election. Now, these two factions are going to go to elections. There's the Fatah, there's the PLO, there's the Palestinian Authority on one side, which is saying, okay, we can reach an agreement with Israel, but there's the fundamentalist Hamas on the other side. Now, the Hamas realized, and the world's realized, because every time there's a democratic election inside the Muslim world, we saw that in Egypt after the first rebellion. I don't know if you remember, there was the Arab Spring, and the Egyptians, toppled the Mubarak government, which was a dictatorship, and wanted democratic elections. Anytime there's democratic elections in the Muslim world, the Muslim fanatic, crazy jihadist factions are the one who take to the streets and sweep up the elections. And the same thing would have happened here. If there had been democratic elections inside the Palestinian world, the Hamas which is basically Al Qaeda with the Palestinian flag, would have taken the democratic elections. So the Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, say, wait a minute, let's stop. We don't want to give them that kind of power. So they annulled and canceled the elections. Hamas sees its authority and its leadership being eroded and decides to turn on the only way that they know how to gain fame and gain authority in among their people, and turn on the fire with Israel.
Yeah, that's what I thought. This is what was happening. Thank you for making it so clear. And I think that it also helps their cause that the U.S. is under a different administration.
Yeah, and let's put it this way: until now, the world would have said to the Palestinians, wait a minute, this is Al Qaeda, this is ISIS. We're afraid of people cutting off heads and throwing people off roofs. We don't want the Hamas in power. In fact, the United States of America has designated the Hamas a terrorist organization for all of these reasons. But now you have an administration who doesn't want to kind of push up against that too much, has a large segment of its, I'm going to say, its power base, the Democratic power base in America, that is siding with those poor victim Palestinians, doesn't want to cross their thresholds. So the United States is not going to be as much against the Hamas. The European world, for all kinds of reasons, some of them are actually large Muslim populations inside Europe, and some of them is traditional anti-Semitism, is not going to side with Israel. Those two elements are coming together. So all of a sudden the Hamas says, wait a minute, this is our time. We have a time. So they fire, listen to this, 7,500 rockets into civilian population. I mean, think about Mexican drug lords firing 7,000 rockets into downtown San Diego from Tijuana because they like what's going on in the United States, or because they want to start a war among themselves.
We're up to 7,500 now?
We're up to 7,500.
Oh my goodness!
No, sorry, no, the other way. 1,700. Sorry.
Okay, so it's I thought it was a lot. Okay, so it's about almost 2,000 rockets.
Almost 2,000.
Yeah.
By the way, the estimate is they have 14,000.
Do what?
The estimate is that they have 14,000 rockets inside Gaza.
And they come from Iran?
They come from a couple sources. I mean, one of the sources is if you take a telephone pole, okay, and put fins on one side and explosives on the other side, you can make a rocket. And don't forget, the rocket doesn't have to be accurate. It doesn't have to be safe. 30% of the rockets fired of Israel fall inside the Palestinian territory. Yeah. That's a number that a lot of people don't know. A lot of the casualties inside the Palestinian territories, or somebody firing a rocket from somebody's backyard and the rocket explodes because it's not built in the correct manner, and right. The people in the house die from that. Now, who's going to get blamed? You know that's the way the warfare goes. So again, what we're trying to say is that they're using those rockets as much because they have an internal problem. And I brought something up on James' show yesterday that I think is sounding true, and I'm going to repeat this here so maybe somebody else really understands. And it's connected to the political situation inside Israel. We are on our fourth election. The Israeli government hasn't created a coalition. But one of the interesting things about this election was that for the first time, a Muslim Arab political party made enough votes, got enough votes to be a player in the political idea, and it was going to be a major player in the coalition that was created in Israel, which means a fundamentalist Muslim party had decided we are going to play the political game and not the terror game. And they had actually succeeded in becoming the tiebreaker in a very complex election.
Wow, I didn't know that.
I truly believe that when Hamas sees this, and they see that the way of moderation and the way of dialogue and the way of political activism and discourse had actually become successful, they see that their leadership would be taken away from them. And they turn on the fire.
Okay, so it was threatening them that they would lose their grip on Gaza and
and the West Bank.
do you think the Abraham Accord are playing a role turning the tides and making the Palestinian cause looking more like like a
A
non
lost cause.
a lost cause?
Yes, there was a growing sentiment there is a growing sentiment among the Palestinians that, okay, again, I like to do things from the ground point of view. Let's think that you are a young Muslim, uh, 18, 19, 20-year-old living in Gaza City. And you have been brought up to think that you have the best religion. You have been brought up to think that your prophet is the most amazing thing. You've been brought up to think that the great Arab nation is the most important. But on every turn in your life, you're seeing that your religion, your leadership, your political system, your fanaticism has not brought you anything positive, and you're living off of $5 a day with no future to look at. And you're saying, we're the great people. We can take on the Jews. But, you've lost to the Jews 5 major wars. Oh, we can make them suffer. Oh, yes. So there were terrorist attacks. There was an intifada, but that really didn't change the situation. Okay. So you say, okay, we'll shoot rockets. So the Jews put up an Iron Dome. Okay, we'll dig tunnels. So the Jews put down a system where you can't dig the tunnels. So you're frustrated. You say the Arab world is going to stand for us. The Arab world is going to exert its pressure. But the Arab world is saying, we don't want to exert our pressure for you because the problem in the Middle East is not Israel. The problem in the Middle East is the Palestinians. And we have more complex issues to deal with. We have Iran knocking on our back door. So we have to deal with that. And this young Palestinian living in Gaza says, okay, what about me? And that frustration, and we've seen it. You see this in the gangs in LA. You see this young man with no future, with no hope, with no leadership, okay, saying to themselves, I've got nothing to lose, and selecting the way of violence. And if you want, in a nutshell, I feel sorry for these young Palestinians that really, they have no hope, they have no spiritual hope, they have no political hope, they have no economical hope. What do they have left but to go and die in the name of the great God, in the name of jihad? Because at least in their death, they will receive honor. And we don't really realize that the Muslim world is a world of honor and not a world of truth. It's about honor and disgrace and not about truth and freedom. It's two
Correct.
different mindsets.
Correct.
And so he says, the only way for me to get the honor, to get the pride that I need is by dying for the cause. And here you have, in a nutshell, the motivator for what's going on.
So we haven't seen Hezbollah or Syria get involved. It's really not it's not their thing right now. They're trying to stay away from. This is really between Hamas and Israel, basically.
Well, no, and maybe we'll go into that, but okay, let's go this way. Hezbollah has decided to stay out, but there's pressure from underneath for them to get into this story. So yesterday, 6 rockets were fired from Lebanon into Israel. They missed. They were not fired by Hezbollah. They were fired by other Palestinian factions that did this under the Hezbollah radar inside Lebanon. Today, there's a demonstration on the border.
Basically, to stir the pot.
Exactly.
Okay.
Today, there's a demonstration, about 20 activists on the border with Lebanon. Okay, I just saw it on the news a few minutes ago, which means that they're thinking. But Hezbollah, like you said, has been very careful to stay out of this. The reason is that Hezbollah has almost completely destroyed Lebanon. Almost completely. Everything in Lebanon is falling apart because of Hezbollah, and they are on their back foot right now. Not because of anything that Israel has done, that great explosion in Beirut and the economic situation. So, and Israel has made it very clear that if Hezbollah does get into this, that might be the button that pushes Lebanon over the edge. So they are staying out. So to answer your question, there's pressure for them to get in, but they are staying out. But today, the demonstration started in the West Bank.
Just today.
Was today, massive demonstration in the West Bank, which was reasonably quiet for the last couple of days. And as you mentioned before, and the most important, I think the most dangerous aspect of what's going on is what's happening in Lod and in Ramle and in other cities, even in Haifa to a certain extent, where Israeli Arab populations are starting to turn up the fire, and that is a major issue. Tonight, by the way, is going to be a very interesting, I think, transition point for that. We'll have to watch and see what happens tonight in Lud. The city is down on curfew, and that has us much more worried, I think, than even the rockets to a certain extent. And if you
Why
want to go
tonight?
into that,
What tonight? Is there something happening tonight?
well, it's been growing and growing and growing, and tonight there's a feeling that this is where the clashes either start dying down or start growing further.
So when, not that I'm looking forward to that at all, but when would we start calling this a third intifada? What constitutes
If what happens in the Muslim world, in the Arab world, inside Israel, starts rising up, where mixed cities like Jaffa, like Akko, like Haifa, like Ramle, where there's a large Arab Muslim population and a large Jewish population, if the clashes come down to the street level, meaning neighborhoods against neighborhoods, okay, we are talking about a much bigger kind of issue than enemies outside firing into us. If the situation, the tense situation between Arab Israelis and Jewish Israelis starts unraveling, and in a nutshell, people don't realize that Arabs and Jews live very close together inside Israel. Israel has the largest Arab Muslim minority of any Western state. We have, in numbers, more Muslims in percentage in Israel than you have in France.
Wow.
The percentage of Muslims living in Israel is almost 20%.
Yeah, I think
one out of every.
in France is 11 or 12%, I think.
Something like that. So if the Arab coexistence, the Muslim coexistence with Jews comes apart because of what's happening, that is much more dangerous to Israel than rockets from outside.
Yeah, and that's a fear that people have expressed. Now, how effective is the Iron Dome? I mean, is it running out of steam because you shoot like dozens of rockets at the same time? I mean, how dangerous is that?
Okay, the Iron Dome is amazing. It's got above a 90% interception rate. I don't know the numbers, and nobody's probably saying it officially, but that means if you fire 100 rockets at Israel, 90 of them will be intercepted. Okay, but that still means that probably about 5 or 6 will get through.
Right.
Now, if 5 or 6 rockets fall on a neighborhood, okay, 2 of them are going to fall in the street, 1 of them is going to fall in the park, 1 of them is going to fall in the field, but 1 of them is going to fall on the house. And if 1 of them falls on the house, or 2 of them fall on the house, in one case, nobody's going to be, because we're all in the bomb shelter, but in one case, somebody is going to be hurt. So even with a 90, 92, 96%, somewhere in between effective, you still do not have a totally, rocket-proof system. And more than anything, you need to understand the Iron Dome is a terror weapon. A defensive weapon. Meaning the Iron Dome doesn't kill anybody. We don't fire it against anybody.
Right.
It is a totally defensive mechanism. It's a suit of armor. A suit of armor is completely defensive. Okay, it doesn't kill anybody. All right. The rockets are doing the killing.
Right.
And I actually heard somebody said it's not fair that Israel has the Iron Dome and the Palestinians don't. And I said, oh my God, what kind of moral equivalency is that?
It's I mean, and then I see a lot of that going on, and what I see also is some sort of a global response against Israel and the Jewish people. And what concerns me is that not just in Israel, not just in the Arab Jewish neighborhood, but I see now that what's happening in Israel is triggering a lot of hatred of the Jews anywhere in the world. and creating new waves of anti-Semitism. What do you think of that? I mean, you see that as a threat too? Because it's becoming increasingly dangerous to even say you're Jewish. And now when there is a war or conflict like this, we don't want to call it a war yet, but a conflict like this in Israel, then Jews anywhere in the world are at risk of being victims of anti-Semitism. I've seen it.
There is a spiritual absurdity in what is going on. The Western world, as we know it, has become a world where victimhood has been elevated to martyrdom, to everybody celebrated. I
Heroism.
mean, if you're a victim, you're better than anybody else.
You're a hero.
Yeah, and parts of our population has turned victimhood into an asset. We even had a princess come and say she was a victim, and everybody applauded for her. So I mean, and we have this mentality. The Palestinians very shrewdly have plugged into this victimhood sentiment. Okay, we are the victims, we're being downtrodden, and all the people who are turning victimhood and indigenous peoples and indigenous traditions, okay, have embraced the Palestinians as one of their own. When you think about it, though, what's the absurdity? If there ever was a people who were a victim, if there ever was a population who was a victim, it's the Jewish people. Amen. No people have ever been victimized for who they are and what they are than the Jews. The only problem is that the Jews never embraced victimhood. We never turned our victimhood into a flag. We never said, and Jews came out of the Holocaust, and on one hand did amazing things for the American economy and for the United States of America, the influx of Jewish immigrants, and on the other hand went and created the state of Israel. We didn't sit down and say we're the victims, take care of us. We went and we did that. And that is dynamically opposed to the mentality of what the Western world is going today. So now the Jews are being victimized for not being correct victims. And think about this. That's the absurdity of this situation. And I have no doubt that this is as much a spiritual war. Otherwise, who the Jews are and what they've gone through would be applauded, even according to woke progressive ideas. Judaism, Israel should be applauded. But because it's Israel, it's not. And you can only realize that there's something else going on.
Yeah, it's I often say that Satan has the ability to make the irrational look very rational. So that's what people look around the world. They look at things that they would look for any other country in the world. They would look like this. We should not let that happen. We should speak up against it. But for Israel, it's the opposite. It's something that's very irrational. But for some reason, there's a disconnect. It's for Israel. It looks like it's the right thing. If we go against Israel and against the Jews.
I have a nice illustration for this, and let's see if this will work. Let's say I told you a story about an island nation in the Pacific who had a very strong tradition. They had their own language. They had their own religion. They had their own dress and their own dance. And we would applaud this. And they were very colorful. And for many years, they were an asset to all the different islands in the region. And one day, and again, we really, really applauded. They have a style and a language that, and a song that, we've all been learning. They were very wise, and they wrote books about very, very deep traditional things. And then one day they were conquered by an army and they were exiled from their island. So they live in all the different islands, but they managed to keep their traditions alive. They managed to keep their language alive. They managed to keep their wisdom alive. And we applaud this, that this is an indigenous people. And after many, many years, they come back to their island and they recreate their traditions and recreate their language and recreate their life. And they become a light to the rest of the islands in the Pacific. And we would say, wonderful. Isn't this an amazing story? Until you say this is the Jews.
Well, yeah. Do you think this is what happened in 48? Or do you think the world immediately when I don't think they immediately went against the Jews like I see your illustration is it you make a point here, but I don't think it happened in 48. I think it took a little while. I think
I think it took a little while.
okay,
I
yeah.
think it took a little while, and I think here's the weird thing: what was playing a role as much as anything else is that in 1948, just after World War II, the world was
In shock.
bleeding. The world was bleeding, um, and I think the in light of what happened, Christian love managed to seep through in a way. 1948, the end of World War II, is a very interesting period when you think about this, because think about the United States of America together with the Allies, but the United States of America won World War II, saved the world to a certain extent. I mean, both on the Pacific theater and the European theater. And look at what the United States of America did in both sides as the victor. It didn't vanquish, it didn't stomp in, it didn't take everything. It went and rebuilt Japan and rebuilt Germany on both cases. In my way, and from a historical point of view, they did something very Christian as a nation. Okay, there was a Christian spiritual movement going through the world at the end of World War II. And the United States, I think, embodied godly Christian values in a political arena at the end of 1948, at the end of World War II. And 1948, the rebirth of Israel, I think God was preparing the political, spiritual backdrop for bringing his people back to the Holy Land. It would not have happened if this feeling of godliness was not permeating the whole world stage. If you're following what I'm saying.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
thing is that today we're going opposite direction.
Good
And
opposite direction.
further the United States and the Western world moves away from godliness and Christian values, I'm going to say this in a really weird way, the further the United States of America moves away from Jesus and everything that he taught, the further or the less support there is going to be for Israel and everything that is actually part of God's plan.
Right. And and I've always believed, since I've been a believer and follower of Jesus, that the blessings that God poured upon the United States were connected to the way the United States treated Israel and the Jewish people. So if we depart from that completely,
you're in your way for a big balagan.
Yeah, big balagan. Now, people on my show might not know what balagan is. What does it mean, balagan?
Oh, balagan is a beautiful word. It's mix up, everything that doesn't go according to plan.
Chaos.
And in this case, chaos. But by the way, it's not completely in the Israeli vocabulary. It's not completely zero. I mean, it's not completely negative. You could say, we went to that party. It was a fun balagan. Right. Okay, or we really had a balagan time out on vacation this time, and it was so it's there's a turmoil or everything. But right. In this case, I would say this: there's a godly balagan going on. People are leaving. The world is leaving God's values, God's ethics, God's ideas. Can you imagine? I don't know. Can you imagine Iran winning a war against Iraq tomorrow, for instance? God forbid there's another war, and being so Christian towards the vanquished people? It wouldn't happen today.
No, it's a different culture. It's a different mentality. It's a different ideology. So that would never happen, and that's something that people need to understand: is that the West values the sanctity of life. That other side basically will not hesitate to kill people to further their agenda. They don't value life. It's almost like they worship death.
No, that by the way, they will say that they worship death. You ask a Palestinian mother whose son blew herself up in a suicide attack somewhere in Tel Aviv, and she said, "Okay, I embrace death because this is to the joy of Allah." They have a God that actually determines human sacrifice. Now, don't get me wrong. I've been in battle many, many times. I've put my life on the line many times. I put the lives of other men and people on the line so many times, but I never wanted anybody to die. I never saw that as a positive thing. That was always a terrible thing.
Right.
And comrades in arms who fell on my left and on my right were terrible, terrible tragedies. Okay, but to say I want my son to die in the name of Allah, okay, that means that somehow the whole idea of Abraham and Isaac in Genesis, where you do not need to sacrifice human beings to God, and God said, this is not what I want. I do not want human sacrifice anymore, and basically ended human sacrifice in the world forever. We are actually, to a certain extent, regressing back to there, where the Palestinians are holding up their dead and saying, this is the sacrifice I'm sacrificing in the name of God.
Yeah.
And there's something deeply wrong with that.
It's it's very it's the other side of the coin. It's the opposite of what the Western values and the Christian values. Now, we need to wrap this up. I have a couple more questions. I'm curious, what do you think is going to happen in the next few weeks in Israel, in that region? Is that going to continue to escalate, or are they going to send troops on the ground through Gaza to put an end to it? What do you see is coming?
Israel's going to try not to. And the question is, and here's the weird thing, the question is, what are the Palestinians, or how far the Palestinians, or how many Palestinians are they willing to die before they say this is not going anywhere? And that's what always happens. By the way, I want to talk about the troops on the ground and again to understand or to explain the moral equivalency. I've been in Gaza many times. I've crossed the border from Israel into Gaza many times. I know what's going on in there. It is a very highly saturated, difficult, urban combat situation where people are hiding literally behind their home population. They're firing rockets and firing at the forces going into Gaza from inside apartment buildings. That's the situation. Everything underground is bombed, mined. I mean, it's going to be a terrible, terrible battle. But they are looking for that because, again, they're willing to sacrifice their people in the name of their God. That's part of the idea.
Right.
But do you understand that the reason I am going to be sending our children, our soldiers into Gaza is to save Palestinian lives? Now, people don't understand this. Israel has the fourth largest air force in the world. I've seen what a one-ton bomb does to a neighborhood. You drop a one-ton bomb on the neighborhood, okay, and 3 city blocks get completely demolished. Israel could drop a one-ton bomb on every place that fires a rocket, and according to legal aspects of the Geneva Convention, that is still not considered an act of terror. Meaning, if you fire at me and I fire back, I am allowed to use a bigger gun to fire at you, and it is not breaking the ethics of war. Does that make sense?
Sure.
If other people are hit or hurt as collateral damage as a result of me firing back with a bigger bomb, then the responsibility, and that's what Dr. Newman says, the war crime is on you because you actually fired at me from inside your civilian population. That's a war crime. So Israel could drop a one-ton bomb and clear out all of Gaza. The reason we don't is we don't want to kill their civil population.
That's
right. And the reason we're going to send the tanks in and the soldiers house to house, door to door, is to save Palestinian lives.
And probably suffer many more casualties on the Israeli side.
Exactly. So I'm sending my army into harm's way, putting them in life-threatening situations to save Palestinian lives. Why does nobody else understand that?
And then the world is looking at Israel as the bad guy. Okay, you know what? We would go another hour of me being frustrated and upset if we even.
No, wait. But I want to tie up to what we said before. Olivier, me and you are Jewish. I am not surprised when people hate us for being Jews. It's
right.
Normal. I mean, go back to Exodus. Okay, we're not surprised when people try to kill us. I mean, I think you probably know the famous Jewish joke about what's a Jewish celebration.
They try to kill us. We won. Let's eat.
That's it. We're not surprised. We celebrate people who want to kill us. We know about that. I'm not surprised that the Palestinians want to kill me. because I add the Palestinians onto a long line of the Persians, the Greeks, the Romans. The Germans. It's not surprising. We as Jews know that we bear the brunt of being God's chosen people. What's surprising to me is that Christians who believe in God buy into the rhetoric of the people who want to kill God's people.
Yeah,
that's what's surprising. I'm not surprised at the enemy doing what the enemy wants. The enemy wants to do that. We've had enemies down like that down through the ages. That's not what's surprising me. And maybe this is why I'm here to look at the people living here in the United States and saying, wait a minute, you know my history as well as I do. You know the biblical history. You know the political history. Why are you buying into this? Why are you another Haman who wants to kill the Jews in Persia? Why are you another Roman Empire who wants to kill the Christians for who they are in Rome? Why are you becoming one of those that you've read about, you've seen, you've heard about down to the ages? Why are you becoming one of these? And that's, I think, a question that needs to be addressed to the Americans and the whole, the Western world and the whole, but to American Christians in particular.
Well, that's actually, it's a perfect segue to my last questions. What can believers in America do beyond the easy answer is, oh, I'll pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Well, that goes without saying.
Wonderful.
That's good. That's good. But what else can Christians in America do in a situation like right now? I have some ideas, but I want to hear your opinion.
Well, let's start off with the beginning, is that this is still a Western style democracy. And people living in a Western democracy still have impact over what's happening. I'll give you an example. I think that whoever sits in the White House is a major part of this battle that we're talking about. And I think we have an administration that does not see Israel in the same way as some of the administrations have in the past. You have political power, and very interesting that I've seen popular movements create political weights in the United States over the last 2 or 3 years. And there are many, many different cases, some of them even illegal. And what I'm trying to say is, you as a Christian, because you're a Christian, because you believe, because you read the Bible, okay, you know what the right thing is, but you also have political power. The churches should not be moving away from politics. They should be stepping into politics. You should not be afraid to say what's your opinion. And what Christians, first of all, need to do is not to buy into this moral equivalency. It's like somebody told me that the school system in the United States is changing and starting to see all religions as the same, which means the public school system is saying things like, oh, well, Christianity, Islam, Judaism, and witchcraft are all the same thing. They're all religions. And if we want respect for one, we should have respect for another. But you as a Christian know that's not true.
That's not true.
You can't put a moral equivalency between the worship of Satan and the worship of Jesus Christ. You can't put them on the same level. So if somebody says that, you're not supposed to say, oh, yes, I agree. I mean, it's the same thing. You're supposed to say, no, it's not the same thing. And what I'm trying to say is, on the basis more than anything, Christians need to stand up and say, truth, our values, our ideology, our spiritual weight has to be put in a place. Don't just say, rockets and bombs, the Jews and the Arabs, it's all the same thing. It's not the same thing. And stand up for your morals more than anything.
So stand up, speak up. I would say stand up, speak up, and continue to pray would be the three things that we would do. And, it reminds me of that.
Well, educate yourself about the truth. And maybe that's why we're here.
I was going to say, this is why we do what we do. This is why you do what you do. You in a way, when you do your tour guide job in Israel, you educate people about the truth about Israel in a fair way. And when we do videos like this, we want to educate our audience on what's going on so they can better understand how to pray and not not blindly by the lies of the media or the political factions around the world that are turning doing a role reversal from perpetrators to victims between Israel and Palestinians, which has been something going on now for the last 50 years. And it will continue, and it could get worse if we don't stand up, speak up, and try to make a difference the best we can as believers. Well, David, I could go all day like this, but I don't. This has been very good, and I hope we don't have to do another program like this to discuss further what's going on in Israel with the conflict. I hope it ends soon. My prayer is that it would not escalate into a ground conflict. We don't know.
Well, we don't know. We don't know. And again, part of what we want you to pray for is that the very sensitive, woven connection between Jews and Arabs inside Israel, Jews and Muslims inside Israel, will not be unraveled by the crazies on both sides. You've seen a very good example of how violence between different factions, even on a racial level, can bring out the crazy people on both sides of the discussion. And when that happens, then the fanatics on both sides are the one who are speaking, and the large peaceful majority loses its voice.
Right.
And what I want, if possible, is to ask you to pray that will not happen inside Israel to a certain extent, like it happened in the States in the last couple of years about different things, that
Right.
the crazies and the violence will not take over the narrative, and the 99.9% of the people who live peacefully with each other would not lose their voice in what's going on.
Okay. Well, you know what? I know that I know that my audience is an audience that's in tune with the needs, the prayer needs, and praise for Israel, praise for the safety of both Jews and Palestinians, because we know, not to get into another can of worms here, but we know that the first victims of Hamas are the poor Palestinians that don't want anything to do with that. And so we have to pray for both sides. David, thank you so much. I hope
it's been a pleasure.
It's a joy to have you in the States, but I do hope that you can go back to Israel soon, because this is where your heart is, I know. And thank you for taking the time today to share with us. And God bless you.
Well, I'm going to say this as an Israeli to you and all of your followers. Thank you for your support. We don't take it for granted. And maybe this is one place to say, again, and you've probably touched this, the fact that there are people who love God's people, the fact that there are people who support us, there are people who are willing to stand up for Israel. As Jews, we don't take that for granted. We expect the opposite.
Right.
And I want to say thank you for your support. Thank you for what you're doing. Thank you for your prayers. And thank you for your care. It's important to us as a people.
You're welcome. As they say in your country, Am Israel Chai.
Amen.